I want to talk about a Pilgrim father who's by the name of Brewster. He was a, oh man, excuse me for a minute. Anything else? He was really the only family that made it all the way from Scrooby, England, all the way to the New World. There were others that made it part way. There was others that they picked up along the way, but he was really the only one that made it the whole way. And he was born about 1566. He was an educated man, knew Greek, knew Latin, spent time at Cambridge University. He never completed a full degree. He inherited his father's postal business. I'm not sure exactly how it worked, but it was lucrative. You could make a lot of money in the postal business, and at that time, things like that were handed down. It was during this time even that oftentimes pastorships and bishoprics, as they were called, were handed down. And it was a difficult time for people that believed the Bible, wanted to preach it and hear it, because during this time the struggle was still going on between the church and the state, if you will. The King of England, not that long ago, Henry VIII, had a title bestowed on him. You probably know what it was. He wasn't just king, but he was also, anybody know what he was called also? Yeah, defender of the faith. Yeah, so the whole idea was that the king was the head of both church and state. And what was happening this time was sometimes church people were being forced to pay the tithe. And when they were being forced to pay the tithe, simony was going on. Think about it, if you're forced to pay the tithe, then pastorships and bishoprics, if you will, would be sold and traded back and forth between people. That's what they did. And then once you owned you were the bishop of this particular parish or area, you could sell that or enjoy the fruits of it yourself. And oftentimes they were without a pastor entirely, because if the people were being forced to pay the tithe, after a while the preachers or the bishops, if you will figure it out. And so wait a minute, I'm going to get paid anyway. The money's coming in. Why do I have to go through the nonsense of preaching a sermon and showing up? So oftentimes they wouldn't even show up at all. And it was during this time that the Pilgrims show up on our radar screen. And Brewster was a big one. He was instrumental in establishing a separatist church with Richard Clifton, and they often held their meetings in a home. Brewster and the others were eventually found and forced out. And fleeing prosecution and persecution, they headed to Amsterdam in 1608. So they went from Scrooby to Amsterdam to Leyden, and finally to the New World, Plymouth. Brewster became the church's elder, responsible for seeing that the congregation's members carry themselves properly, both helping and admonishing them when necessary. One thing that's not as well known about the original Scrooby congregation, which later became the Pilgrims, is they had some very able leadership, business-wise, and one of them was William Brewster. Another one was their pastor, John Robinson. John Robinson, if you ever get a chance to study him, a great godly man. He loved Christ, and he loved the sheep. He loved them. And he wanted to come over to the New World with the congregation. He never was able to do that. It turned out that Brewster was, when they got in the ship to come over, the Mayflower and the Speedwell, Brewster was, shall we say, the elder of note, because the greater part of the congregation was staying back in Leyden at the time, and it was felt that Pastor John Robinson should stay back with them. But Brewster was the leading elder at the time. In Leyden, back when he was in Leyden, before he went over to the New World, Leyden, Holland, of course. So again, Scrooby is in England, Amsterdam is in Holland, Leyden is in Holland, and then of course the New World is over here. In Leyden, Brewster worked with Thomas Brewer, Edward Winslow, and others. He began working on a printing press. I couldn't help but notice couldn't help but notice some of these names. I know as Baptists we're teetotalers and we don't drink beer and alcohol and all that kind of stuff, but kind of interesting names here, Brewer and Brewster. Anyway, moving on. They worked at printing press and began publishing religious books and pamphlets that were then illegally conveyed into England. And once again, the way they were conveyed was in wine vats. And read in England as well. So they're over in England, but they're still fermenting things. In Holland, but they're fermenting things, if you will, over in England still. Brewster also employed himself teaching at the University of Leiden students English, teaching English there in a Dutch-speaking country. And by 1618, a couple of years before Plymouth, 1620, the English authorities were onto him and his printing press, and had the Dutch authorities in pursuit of him. This is one of those tricky international things. England being as powerful as it was, and England had a powerful king, not a godly king, a wicked king. This time, James. And James was pressuring the Dutch authorities to solve the problem of this printing press. And so Thomas Brewer was arrested and held in the University of Leiden's prison, but Brewster managed to evade the authorities and went into hiding for a couple of years. And it's very interesting to read about that because he apparently had friends back in Holland. And the English were pressuring the Dutch to find Brewster. And so the Dutch were looking for him, and all kinds of false reports just kept on coming back and frustrating the English. It's a little bit like Martin Luther being captured, if you will, by Frederick the Wise. You recall that Luther was, he had to stand there at Worms. We heard a little bit from Matt Truella about that a couple of weeks ago. Charles V was pressured to kill Luther right now, and Charles V, of course, refused to do that. Well, Luther gets away and gets kidnapped by Frederick the Wise, and the Pope was on to Frederick the Wise somewhat, but he kept on giving him bad information. You know, Frederick knew where Luther was, but communication was bad, and it took a while. The Pope would say, "Turn over Luther," and Frederick would say, "Well, I'm looking for him," and he knew where he was. "I'm looking for him, but I'll let you know when I find him," and tell the Pope that. And the Pope would say, "Well, we've heard he's here," and Frederick would come back and say, "Well, yeah, I heard he's there too, but that's a different duchy, if you will, different little minor kingdom. We have to negotiate this. It's all very, very difficult." And he just kept that up with the Pope. Same thing happened apparently here with Brewster. Just kept on coming back with different reports. He's here. Oh no, he's not. It's someone else. And at one point they arrested what they thought was Brewster, made a big announcement, and turned out got the wrong guy. And he was able to evade the authorities for a couple of years that way. Turns out, by the way, they were looking for him in Holland. Turns out it's now believed that he was back in England the whole time, right under James's nose, and didn't know it. When the Leiden church congregation decided to send the first wave of settlers to establish a colony that everyone could eventually move to, the pastor John Robinson decided to remain behind in Leiden with the majority of the congregation. Now, he came to America, Brewster did, Elder Brewster. He brought his wife Mary and two youngest children, Love and Wrestling.
You can tell which one was the boy and girl.
We feel here that, the children sometimes get a little loud or a little noisy, but how would you like to name your child Wrestling? His wife, Mary, died in 1627. He never, ever remarried. He lived to be nearly 80 years old. He died in 1644, about the time of the Puritan Revolution back in England under Cromwell. His estate inventory lists titles of several hundred books that he owned. Now, a little bit more about him and why he is so important, and who these people were. Did you ever wish to be a pilgrim? Did you ever want to be part of that group? Let me ask you this. Do you think you could show your face publicly at a publicized garden party if you were connected with these particular people? The answer is not hardly. And we'll talk about that very briefly here this morning. I just want to let you know from whence I'm getting some of my information. If you ever get a chance, I don't think this book is available anymore. It was printed in 1945, Saints and Strangers. It's by far, I don't know how you can get it. You can see we're taking really...
It is available.
It's available now?
You can't get it new, you have to
Can't get it new? Okay. Do you know what's the cost at Amazon?
Amazon, anywhere from 97 cents to $30 for something in
For something like this,
perfect
okay.
condition.
I don't know what this duct taped volume is worth, but it's by far the best I've ever found on what happened with these folks. There's information here that I just was never able to find anywhere else. Saints and Strangers, briefly, the New England Pulpit and the American Revolution, and also by Peter Marshall and David Manuel. You've probably seen this book, The Light and the Glory. Some of the things that come out of the Pilgrim struggles that you won't find other places, and that is that the Mayflower Compact, and remember, the Pilgrims in 1620 were not the first successful colony to be established in the New World. We had the Jamestown colony established a few years before. Why then do the Pilgrims get all the credit? Why is that? There were believers in the Jamestown colony, but one thing that the Jamestown colony had that the Plymouth colony did not have was they did not have the old English hierarchy, if you will. You know, the worker bees, if you will. Of course, they had other names for them, earls, nobles, whatever, serfs. Back then, that wasn't quite the name. But you had quite a hierarchy in Jamestown. And what's not known as much is that in Jamestown, the planters came over, and they thought they were just going to get the natives, the Indians, just to do their work for them. Of course, the Indians had other ideas about that. And if you read about Jamestown, they had a starving time. It's called the starving time. And what happened was they simply did not plan for the... They weren't planning. And so they ran out of food. And many died. They had a similar problem in Plymouth. But here's the difference, I believe. The difference between the two is what has become known as the Mayflower Compact. And someday we're going to speak more about that. We don't have time to speak about that a whole lot today. But what happened was the Plymouth, the folks at Plymouth understood that all of a sudden they didn't have this hierarchy anymore. They were just people trying to worship God the way they understood it to be, and they didn't have this boss thing going on, the smart people at the top, the dumb people at the bottom. And so they organized themselves, and the compact was such a brand new idea that we ourselves can govern ourselves. Now, that's going to come from the Bible, my friends. If you know anything about guys like Plato, Aristotle, and their beliefs on ruling, they said things like, hey, some people are born to rule, and some people are born to serve. Some people are born to be masters, and some people are born to be slaves. That's just the way it is. This idea that we can all speak to the body politic is an exclusive Christian idea. And when you read a book like this, right here, The New England Pulpit of the American Revolution, you will see that it becomes really clear that our ideas of representative government and public service came from the pastors who were already trying to work out those ideas in their own churches. I didn't learn this in school when I was in school. But they worked out, they had questions, well, who runs a church? How's a church supposed to be run? And they asked questions like, well, if it's congregational, could the congregation actually overrule the elders of the church, the spiritual leadership? That was an amazing question for them. Let's say the congregation wanted to do one thing, the church leadership wanted to do another thing. Can they do that? And some congregations said, well, yeah, they can. They're the body, they're the assembly. And for others, more of the Presbyterians said, that's ridiculous. You're gonna allow the congregation to overrule the established spiritual leadership? And they worked out and they hammered out these problems earlier on, and it was the not the seculars, but the civil magistrates, if you will, that became the heirs of the hard work that was done by the pastors in the churches. And that hard work began with, I'm convinced, the Mayflower Compact, which is why we venerate, and we should, the Pilgrims, because of that particular Mayflower Compact. Now, I failed to say earlier that when Brewster became a pilgrim, and by the time he was finished, he pretty much lost everything. But he didn't lose everything. William Bradford spoke about Brewster. William Bradford, by the way, was a seminary attendee by the time he was 14. That's kind of the way they did it then. They studied hard. And he was adopted into the Brewster family. He had lost his parents at a young age, and Brewster's family did pick him up and supported him, and he grew up with them. And after Brewster died, he wrote a eulogy of him, and he has this to say, after talking about the sufferings that they endured. He said, I would now demand of any, speaking of Brewster, this is Bradford speaking now, I would now demand of any what he was the worse for any form of sufferings. Was he the worse for it? What do I say worse? Nay, sure, he was the better for it. And then he quotes from 2 Thessalonians. He says, it is a manifest token of the righteous judgments of God, that ye may be counted worthy of the kingdom of God, for which ye also suffer, seeing it is a righteous thing with God to recompense tribulation to them that trouble you, and to you who are troubled, rest with us when the Lord Jesus shall be revealed from heaven with his mighty angels. You see, these pilgrims, they weren't just a happy group of, don't worry, be happy, and ignore the world, and it's going to be all right. They had to face real problems and real challenges. And but they took comfort in this fact that we just read from 2 Thessalonians, something that we don't talk about so much. They took comfort in the fact that God will judge those who are troubling them. There will be an account settled. That's almost supposed to be now a bad thought, right? We're not even supposed to think about that, right? We're not supposed to consider that God will take care of business. Oh, we don't do that. But you know why we don't do that? Because we're not in a fight ourselves. We're not in the battle. So the idea that God will settle accounts, well, there's no accounts to be settled. Because we're sitting on our hands. Not these people. And we just read about Cain and Abel. Well, actually we read about Abel here from Hebrews chapter 11. The funny thing, it's not so funny, but the thing about the Pilgrims was they were the best citizens. They robbed no one. They worked hard. And they were hated. A little bit like Abel, right? You ever wonder what Abel ever did to Cain? He's like on the way past, yo Cain, God's accepting my sacrifice, not yours. That apparently didn't happen at all. But Cain hated Abel just because he was Cain. And just because he was angry at God. And what do you do when you're angry at God? You know what you do when you're angry at God? You kill his people. Because when God came himself and killed him, right? Well, he's ascended now. You can't kill him anymore. But you can kill his people. And that's what James wanted to do. And from Saints and Strangers, I just wanted, as we wrap up here, I just want to talk about an event that happened to them to let you know the extent to which they were serious about promoting the kingdom of heaven. Remember, the Mayflower Compact starts out in the name of God, amen. And they go on to say But their task is to promote the kingdom of heaven on the earth. That's why when we teach that here at IRBC, and John's been going through this, we're not just whistling some kind of Dixie here and saying, well, you know what, we have this view of the kingdom of heaven, and everybody has a different view, and it's all right, we don't care. Their view, my friends, the view the Pilgrims had of the kingdom of heaven, drove them across the ocean, and not just them. That's how important and that's how serious it was. We have a tendency nowadays to take certain doctrinal issues and just put them in the area of academia, right? Well, you know, people have different views or whatever. For these folks, it was a lot different from that. They came across the ocean. James had said to them, well, the king called the Hampton Court Conference early in 1604, taking a personal part in the proceedings, for he fancied himself a theologue. James, the first theology guy. Archbishop Whitgift had carefully seen to it, as almost the last act of his life, that the conference was packed against the reformers. The reformers being those descendants, if you will, of Calvin, Luther, the spiritual descendants. Only 4 moderators were invited to attend, and those were left to cool their heels in the antechamber for days. When admitted at last, they were curtly asked what they wanted, and the bishops immediately created a diversion by falling upon them for daring to appear before His Majesty in turkey gowns, not showing the proper respect to the king. So in other words, the king calls a conference to deal with the reformers. Only 4 are allowed to come, and then he insults them by keeping them out of the proceedings for days. These are the kind of things these folks have to deal with. Finally, they're allowed to come in, and the first thing that happens when they come in is they're attacked for what they're wearing. Now again, we've talked about this before. You know how it is when you get in these discussions, right? You're personally attacked. Well, mercilessly badgered, misrepresented, and insulted, with the king joining in the sneers and abuse, the Puritans refused to be provoked and behaved themselves very well, one of them even venturing at the first opportunity to make a restrained plea for liberty of conscience. This is supposed to be a theology conference, right? The last thing we're going to discuss is theology. We're going to talk about what the Puritans were wearing and attack them, laugh at them, mock them, and abuse them. Finally, one of them says, well, we want liberty of conscience, meaning, James, we want to be free of you. I will have none of that, thundered James, and at the mention of the Scottish Church and its more democratic organization, he worked himself into a characteristic fit of slobbering rage. A Scottish presbytery as well as agreeth with the monarchy as God and the devil. Then Jack and Tom and Will and Dick shall meet, and at their pleasure censure me and my council and all our proceedings. Well, James, now you're getting it. That was exactly what was necessary. That has been the history of the church, has it not? That's been the history of ecclesiastical movement and what they do, right? When the king steps out of line, who's supposed to speak to him? I ask. Throughout the scriptures, when the king stepped out of line, who was it that spoke to the king? It was God's prophets. Interesting that James sort of did get it. That explosive political issue had not yet been posed, but it must be said that for James, that he sensed the drift of the argument, it was impossible to confine the demand for freedom of conscience, for freedom of thought and speech, to the field of religion alone. That's why, in our First Amendment to our Constitution, do you ever realize what's in the First Amendment of the Constitution? It's not just so-called freedom of speech or freedom of assembly or freedom to redress. Within the First Amendment is Congress shall make no law regarding or respecting an establishment of religion. And then the rest follow. It was because of these godly men who made the case back then, that you can't keep it just a religion. James figuring it out here. Retreating from that issue, the Puritan delegates ended by asking merely that ministers should no longer be required to wear the surplice when conducting Sunday services. Can we get away from our Anglican outfits? We're asking. Nicely. Away with your sniveling, cried the king, breaking up the conference with an ominous threat. He and his mother, he said, had been haunted from their cradles by a Puritan devil, and he feared it would not leave him till his grave. But he would put down such malicious spirits, even at the cost of his crown. I will make them conform, he thundered, or I will harry them out of the land. 4 guys, he's worked himself into a slobbering rage, and he's going to solve them one way or another. Well, just one event that occurred, and we don't have too much time to talk about it, but the Pilgrims had to get out of England. They knew James wanted to do them harm. How do you get out of the country when they don't want you out? You see, James knew they were trying to get out, so he influenced other countries not to take them. Well, they put all their money together at one point and made a deal with an English captain, sold their homes, what money they could put together, gave their money to the English captain, got on a ship, going to go to Holland, and you can guess what happened. The English captain took their money and turned them right over back to the English again. Some went to jail, some were let out, but now they're still trying to get out. Now they're a lot poorer. Well, they try again. They work, and it's harder now for them to get jobs. Can you see how being associated with these people might not be the best way to climb the social ladder? Well, what happened afterwards? And I'll just tell the story quickly. This next time they contracted with a Dutch sea captain, and they were, in order to waylay fears about them, they had to do things sort of in secret, if you will. And what they did was, on a boat, they sent away their wives and their children, and the men walked 60 miles, trying to be as inconspicuous as possible. And I don't know how walking 60 miles makes you look inconspicuous, but apparently a lot of people walked during those days. Brewster himself, when he was going to Pastor Clifton's church, walked, he and his family, 6 miles each way to church. Why did I say each way? Of course it's each way. Didn't get any shorter coming home. I'm sure of that. Well, they send the women and the children ahead on a boat. They get off. The men are trying to meet up with them. They get on a boat themselves, and they're going down the river to meet where the women are. What happens is that a group of thugs, if you will, and government officials had found out what they were doing. And they were so despised at this time that even normal citizens were willing to attack and arrest them. So in the middle of this transition here, where they're trying to get everybody in the boat, this group of local thugs and government officials appears on the shore. The captain panics and takes off with the ship with the men on board and the women still on shore. Not only that, they go out to sea and get blown around by a terrible, terrible storm, and we're gone for 2 weeks. Meanwhile, the women with the children, and one of them was Brewster's wife, and this time she had just had another baby. The baby, as far as we know, was days old, are being arrested and put in jail. And you thought wrestling was a funny name. This time they named the baby Fear. Now you can see why. But here's what happened. They dragged the women and the children off to jail. And a funny thing happened on the way to jail. sentiment in England turned to their favor, because it's James, come on James, what are you scared of women and children for? What are they in jail for? So it turned out the women and children almost had a better, they let them go. Some of the men were still there on the shore, and they sent them all home. Except, the problem, at this point they didn't have any homes. They'd sold everything. They had no place to go. They literally had nothing. But they still had friends, and they still were able to live another day. Why do we share this morning? Well, one of the things that I want to wrap up by saying, and I ask this question from time to time, when I get in some theological discussions with some of my contemporaries, I ask this question: is today's theology and religious commitment capable of doing what these people did? I believe we have worked our way into a situation where we have told ourselves that we can love God and not love our neighbor at the same time. Our idea of loving God is that everything's okay between me and God. But these people were interested not only in loving God, but loving their neighbors. And when they meant their neighbors, they meant those people who would still be born. And they felt that they could not raise their families, teach them the gospel in the situation that they were in. You see, today we think more of like, well, hey, you know what, I'm okay, and so we're done. But Christ said the two greatest commandments, first one, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And he said the second one is, remember what he said?
Love your neighbor.
Yeah, it's love your neighbor, and he said, but he gave it a description. Remember what it was? No, that's the wrong question. It's like unto it. See, we tend to think, love God, love your neighbor. Perhaps we should. But if we're in a situation today where we think we're loving God, and we're not loving our neighbor, we need to really think if we're really loving God. These were people that loved both. And many of them died. But we just read from, well, they all died, but some died in jail. Some had their ears cut off. Some were publicly beaten, some were burned. But there's a phrase in the chapter as we wrap this up that we just read. There from Hebrews 11. Do you ever think about this phrase? Of whom the world was not worthy. Ever think about that? We just read that. They're beaten, sawn asunder. Of whom the world lived in caves. Of whom the world was not worthy. The world was not worth their time. The world was not worth their life. So why? Well, here's why. Because when we really do love God, we will benefit the world, even though the world doesn't appreciate it at all. That's not our job to make them appreciate us. Our job is to love God and love our neighbor in spite of what they want to say and do. A lot more we can say about William Brewster. He died at an old age, 80 years old. Apparently they don't know exactly when he was born. One thing that's really neat about him, even when he was older, the man knew Greek, Latin, he knew the Bible, he could teach. But when it came time to get out there in the fields and work with his hands, he was out there just like everybody else. Kind of like Paul. He wasn't too good to get out there and work and not work with his hands. Beside the people he was responsible for. Great man. Well, we'll take just a couple minutes for questions, and then we'd like to hear from the congregation Thanksgiving testimonies. John has a question.
Right there.
Or a comment. Oh, yeah.
So is there a distinction between Pilgrim and Puritan?
Thank you. There is. The Pilgrims were also called separatists, if you will. And they ultimately were the ones that were correct. The Puritans get the ink because they wrote a lot more, and they had a lot more influence back in England than the separatists did. Remember, the issue was the Church of England. And the Reformers were happy with the Church of England because it was a break away from Rome. The Puritans thought they could purify the Church of England. The separatists said, no way, it's gone too far, we're separating ourselves, we're getting out. So they actually took more of a pounding than the Puritans did, at least in the beginning. But it turns out that ultimately the separatists were the ones who were correct, right? At least during that time. There was going to be no purifying the Church of England while James was in charge. So yeah, big difference between the two. When you think Pilgrim, think separatist. The Puritans weren't coming over yet. They came over later. But the separatists came over first because they were separating themselves from England and the Church of England. Question over here.
It's more of a comment. I think the Pilgrims and the Puritans and those who had to go through all that learned how to be thankful for bad things as well as good things. And I think in the American churchianity, it's all, well, you're blessed if good things happen to you, but if bad things happen to you, you get mad at God and shake your fist at it. So being thankful in all things is really important lesson for us to learn.
Absolutely right. And they had great faith. They really did believe the Bible. We just read that again in that faith chapter. People believed that God could even raise. They had faith that what they did was that God was going to pay them back. You know what? If we don't have that kind of faith, we're not trading anything. We're just hanging on to what we have. Trying to live your best life now. This better not be your best life now. You're in big trouble if that's the case.
I'm not sure what the question is, but you were talking about when the wives were released and the men, and they all got sent back, and they had nothing. They went back to nothing. So we could very well face in our own nation that kind of taking of things, and the responsibility that places on us if we're not the ones being taken from, we still have, and people are coming back to us, brothers and sisters in the Lord. Are we willing to fill up our homes when we don't have enough bedrooms and we don't have, I just can hear my house isn't big enough. Well, they went back to houses that weren't big enough.
Sure.
I don't know, what's our responsibility and
Sure.
could we face that?
And into such a wretched lot. It's not like you're entertaining the king and queen of England. You're entertaining these people who James himself had said, I want them out. That's who. But there's just so many characters in these plays, because there were people that are unnamed that did take them in. They didn't go with them, but they did take them, and they were colored, I'm sure, with the same brush.
Well, and I would think
We don't know
that in
the
the
names.
church, they're saying they're crazy. They're the zealots. They're the radicals. You don't want anything to do with them.
Sure. Yeah, I tell you read that book, Saints and Strangers, and you realize just how despised these people were. They were flat out despised. They were scum. No social climbers in that group. There were businessmen in that group and godly people. There were all kinds of people. They were godly people. They were willing to give it up. Brewster stayed fairly successful most of his life. But during the difficult times, he cut down on his rations just like everybody else. All right, then, what we'd like to do is open up for testimonies from the congregation. And John, I think you have